So I think for me, like physical sense of like your actual sense of taste, you may happen to like the cheapest wine the best. And that's fine. But our society tells us that it's not, because if you want to be perceived as something, whatever it may be, you wouldn't be drinking that box of wine, right? You would be drinking this fancy bottle of wine. And that's, I think, where this lesson is really important, is because it detangles it and it helps you examine it. It's like, why am I choosing this really expensive bottle of wine at the store?
What does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit in that? We tackle those questions and others in the School of Financial Freedom podcast. We talk about the role of money in our personal growth and spiritual liberation, the concrete math of budgeting and saving and investing, and how all this relates to the life you were meant to lead. Each episode is an interview with a former student of my online course, Financial Freedom 1, where they explain their favorite lesson and years later, what financial, behavioral, and spiritual impact it had on them. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of School of Financial Freedom, and your host. Glad you're here.
Hi, this is Jessica, and you're listening to the School of Financial Freedom podcast.
So one of my favorite things about teaching financial freedom is that I become friends with a fair amount of my students. And Jessica here has become a pretty good friend through her taking the course and us staying in touch since. So I'm super excited to have her come talk about this lesson, which is lesson 2.1, which is about status roles, status identity, and marketing, and tiny details, exaggeration syndrome. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, Jessica, tell us when you took Financial Freedom 1.
So I took Financial Freedom 1 in the fall of 2018, so about 6 years ago.
Okay. And what has happened since for you financially?
So financially speaking, I had came to the course with already some background and interest in FI and the FIRE movement, and had been following that along for quite a few years. But I felt like there was a lot of information and depth missing from that conversation. And ultimately, I was drawn to the course because I wanted to have a deeper conversation about kind of the emotional side of things, the way our thinking happens, the way that that's kind of tied in with our finances. And I thought this course would be a great way to sort of get a more well-rounded perspective on finances and how to think about my finances and how we think about finances in the context of our society and the world. And so in that class, I was able to sort of examine my spending habits and my money habits and my connection to capitalism and understand at a little bit of a deeper level where I wanted to make changes and what my priorities ultimately were. And so since that class, and I think it's an evolving conversation and an evolving set of goals, because I have a child at the time, he was 1. And as I understand more about being a parent in the world and having a kid and what that means and what his needs are, that continues to change the financial conversation. So a lot has happened in those 6 years. But ultimately, my goals continue to evolve, and I sort of continue to refine my perspective on finances and how I am making decisions that are aligned with my values and what my values are, and having that conversation continue in a way that I didn't necessarily have the language to have that conversation before, and how it connected with finances.
So you took this course in 2018 when you're 34. In Module 3, we make a plan for when you want to hit financial independence. 6 years ago, what was your expected crossover date?
So 6 years ago, I had said that I would cross over on my 40th birthday. And that was at the time, I thought, a really aggressive goal. Like there's no way, but let's shoot for the moon and see what could happen.
And you just turned 40.
And I just turned 40.
And where are you? Yeah.
Yeah. And we hit the goal that we had set basically just before my 40th birthday. So it's pretty wild. I think a lot of that is due to the performance of the stock market over the past few years, which has kind of been historically bonkers. And also the fact that I made that goal was very helpful in having direction to plan for, but also the goal has evolved. So even though I hit the goal that I had set 6 years ago, I have felt now, and especially with things that have happened over the past few years with inflation and understanding the way prices of things have changed, I've reset the goal, which is maybe I've set a new goal, which is another part of the FI conversation, is that continues to evolve.
Right. So on some level, I mean, the whole idea is that the plan isn't the idea. The planning is the idea. And it's amazing that, you hit your original goal of your number at age 40, but your number has changed. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, the number has changed.
Yeah, which is totally reasonable. And I mean, I just want to stop here and just say how remarkable it is that you hit that number at age 40, because, well, I mean, people are astounded by me. Like, I hit it at 42. You're like 2 years younger. Like, I don't know how many more years that you want to continue working, but let's say it took you 5 more years to hit the number you wanted. Like, if you hit financial independence at 45, that's still a very remarkable accomplishment. So you talk about the stock market has gone historically bonkers, but there are 2 other major things in personal finance. I always talk about it as a 3-legged stool. That number 1, you have to earn money. You have to earn more money. You have to keep costs low, and you have to invest. And so you talked about how the stock market has grown exponentially in the last few years. But the other 2 legs, just briefly talk about what's happened for you in the other 2 legs of the stool.
Yeah. So the other 2 legs, so the first one would be around keeping costs low. By nature, I've always been a fairly frugal person, and I have continued on that path. So despite the temptation, I think, of having a kid and getting involved in lots of things, I've found ways to continue to be frugal and continue to be on that path, which has been really important, because the other leg of the stool has been about increasing my income. And so I made some significant career moves, basically in that vein, to try and increase my income as much as I could, to find a job that had better and more stable benefits, had access to a 401k and matching. And I made that a major goal. So that way I could balance keeping costs low, trying to reach the goal, and then taking advantage of the compounding that was available in the market with it doing so well.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think that is the biggest resistance for most people who take FF1. And quite frankly, most people, we all have economic set points on what we expect our incomes to be and what we think we deserve to earn. And it's very hard to get off that set point. Are you willing to share how much you were earning in 2018 versus how much you're earning now?
Yeah. So in 2018, I was probably in the ballpark of 100,000 a year. And at that point in time, I had no 401k matching. I had significant cost for the benefits because my company's benefits were not great. They had a super high deductible. The employer did not contribute at all to the health insurance premiums. So I made a healthy amount of money. I was very lucky to be in that role. And it ate away just because I didn't necessarily have the benefits that balanced out having that high salary. And I would say trying to think back, so 2018, I moved into a different role at that company, which increased my salary to maybe 115. I think I maxed out around 115 at that company, and realized that there wasn't a lot of room for me to grow financially there. I tried pitching some profit sharing. It was a smaller company, so I was trying to get as creative as I could to pitch ways to increase the finances, but ultimately just didn't happen. And I realized that I had kind of capped out there. And then in 2020, COVID happened. And so that, I think, took us all for a huge left turn. And I was busier than ever. I work in tech, and specifically in commerce development, e-commerce websites. And that was nuts. We were the busiest we ever were. I was very lucky to be in that field because it meant that it was extremely in demand. And I worked on a pretty niche platform. And so I was able to make a move and really try to negotiate the highest salary that I possibly could. So I was very privileged to be able to do that. And I took advantage of that time period and moved to another company and essentially doubled my salary. And that was in about 2021 was when I officially started, was 2021. And I doubled my salary to $200,000, essentially overnight.
Yeah, with benefits, right?
With great benefits. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is, you say that you're privileged, and you are, but I think the message I would want to give for most people is they are capable of earning much more salary than they currently are. And quite frankly, for a lot of people I know, including much of my FF2 cohort right now, you can earn more salary and have less stress. That may not be the case for you, but most people I know earn more salary and have less stress as they go up the organizational ladder. Anyways, one last thing I want to mention is since you took FF1, you got really involved in helping others with their personal finance. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was volunteering for an organization, which is no longer around, which is really sad. But essentially, it was an organization called Innovative Changes, and it opened doors to people who just had financial questions. Basically, the fact that talking about finances is so taboo in our society, this organization aimed to change that by not having a particular, you didn't have to have a need, you didn't have to have a issue that you were going through. It was literally, we're here. What questions do you have? How can we help? And just around having someone to talk about finances with. So that was my first dipping my toe in the water there. And I volunteered with them for years. It was a wonderful experience. And then I also am a part of a group just on Facebook. I found them. So it was Women's Personal Finance. And I've worked with them. Well, I'm not working with them. I shouldn't say that. It feels like I am because it's a gift. Like the whole community works with each other, kind of sharing these tidbits of advice and being a little bit further down the path. I value being able to share that back to people at the beginning because I didn't have that when I was starting, and I was kind of scrambling all over to find other people who thought similarly to me or who had the information that I could talk with. And so I really appreciate just being that person. And I joke that I'm playing the long game with my friends because they all know that I've been involved and interested in this for a decade. And they're finally starting to ask questions about it and say like, hey, I'm curious about budgeting, or can you come to do a house walkthrough with me? Or I'm really interested in looking at these tax documents or whatever it is. So I'm like, yes, I can finally. So having those conversations has been really wonderful. And I love having them with people who know a lot and also people who are just starting.
Well, it's interesting because it brings up to mind the phrase that I heard somewhere else, but I use all the time, which is you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Part of the reason that we don't talk about money is no one else is talking about money. So you are, through the Women's Personal Finance group on Facebook and through your friends, you're actually spreading the idea of it's acceptable and it's actually good to talk about personal finance with people around you. Which brings up, well, first of all, can you give a pitch? I think, I'm doing another financial freedom cohort in October. And my current one only has 2 students. So this next one may be the last one. So what's your pitch for Financial Freedom 1?
I would say the reason that I took Financial Freedom 1 was because I just didn't want to look at the math. I wanted to understand the why behind I was doing things. And I didn't know how to articulate what that was. And it really brings together a massive information about, our society, how we exist in capitalism, and why sort of our brains and our habits have been trained the way they are, and how do we untrain them, and how do we define what we want to train them to do instead. And I think that was so valuable to me because it didn't just say, do this, here's your one size fits all path. It's just stop spending so much money, right? Because it's like, that's what all the blogs are saying. That's what all the podcasts say. And be more picky about what you spend. And you're like, well, how do I know what to be picky about? What do I value? And how do I figure out what do I value? And I feel like Financial Freedom 1 is that lens that says, here's a lot of ways to look at the different aspects of your life, the different ways that we spend as a society, and what fits, what resonates with you and what doesn't, and how, do you want to bring that back to your personal finance journey? Because it's personal, right? And everyone's path looks different.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for that. Again, Financial Freedom 1, maybe the last cohort is October. So sign up at the schoolofinancialfreedom.com website if you're interested. But you're bringing up something else, which is super interesting, that, personal finance is personal and we have to decide for ourselves our values. And this lesson, 2.1 about status roles and status identity and tiny details, exaggeration syndrome, is about how we make those decisions and our values and how we're influenced by society around us. So let's go into the lesson. Yeah, talk about what's in the lesson.
Yeah, so I think that this lesson in particular is really pertinent to the discussion around personal finance being personal, because everything in our society is about trying to make it not personal, right? It's about trying to convince you from an outside lens about what's important. Like, this brand should be more important to you. This coffee is the type of coffee you should drink. These clothes are the type of clothes you should wear. This car is the type of car you should drive. And this lesson is really looking at understanding what's true about that and what's not true about that. Largely, none of it is true. And instead thinking about, for your own values and your own utility, what are your actual needs? Right. And helping think through the process of how we understand what the tiny details are that are actually important to us and what the details are that society is telling should be important to us. Essentially looking at what, and you mentioned this in the course specifically, what is the inner need that we're actually trying to meet? And how much of our spending is going to the inner need and how much of the spending is going to the outer need, or what's perceived and other people's expectations of us.
Yeah, I think my favorite way of explaining this comes from David Graeber, who used to be a London School of Economics professor, who talks about a piece of clothing. He talks about a dress specifically. Like, we think about the utility of a dress as, it keeps our bodies covered and like it keeps us warm. But a tiny percentage of the cost of a dress is the utility of warmth and coverage, right? The chunk of the price of any dress or any piece of clothing is how it looks and how it makes us feel and how other people perceive us. We spent most of our money is spent towards that feeling of how we want to be perceived, how we want to feel, and how other people see us.
Yeah. I think too, and I had shared this with you a bit ago, but I think that what is important about this lesson is it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what other people think of you, because, we all live in reality. So there is a degree of that plays into our psyche every day and plays into our decisions. But it's about understanding that shouldn't be the driving force behind our decisions. Maybe we want to consider that, but also what's the actual utility. So I had shared a story about after I took this lesson in particular, this was 2018, I had been pretty good about being frugal, buying clothing when I needed clothing. But I wasn't necessarily good about buying clothing for the purpose that I was intending to buy it for. I would go and I would say, this is a nice, I need a sweater. This looks like a nice sweater. I will buy this sweater. And I was buying it mostly because I was looking at it visually, the perception of the sweater, and that it was, the article of clothing. After taking this class, I would say, why am I buying this? I feel cold frequently. Right? So I need to buy something that's going to keep me warm. So what can I find that will keep me the warmest? What will feel the best on my skin? Right? And what will also, reasonably fit in, from a fashion perspective without drawing attention in a negative way to myself. Right? So I sort of flipped my script upside down. And so I would go and I very specifically remember going shopping, and it was like this, and it was at a thrift store. I still was being frugal about it. It was at a thrift store, and I had found a sweater, and I was like, oh, this looks great. And I picked it up, and I was ready to check out with it. And I was like, wait a second. It has 3/4 sleeves. The material is kind of thin. What am I doing? I'm going to buy it. I'm going to spend my money. I'm going to get home, and I'm still going to be cold because it doesn't actually fit the utility. And so how can I be just more conscious and purposeful about the way I'm spending my money? And so that, it's a small purchase, right? It's a sweater at a thrift store, so it's inexpensive, but applying that principle across kind of our lives, it makes a big difference. It moves the needle, I think, because I ended up buying this chunky, wonderful sweater that I still have 6 years later, and I basically wear it all winter long. And it's great. I have one sweater. I grab my sweater. It's acceptable. I wear it. It's cozy. It's cute. So, yeah. And it's lasted for 6 years.
It's funny because you're absolutely right. I think about Buffalo Exchange is 2 blocks from my house. So I go infrequently, but I go. And, when I look at the random stuff at Buffalo Exchange, the very first thing I look at, and I'm sure 99% of people do the same thing, is how will I look on it wearing this, right? Mm-hmm. They're not thinking, oh, what is the utility of this, right? Everyone is thinking, how will this look on me? And that is basically what you're talking about. The utility of the item is how it will make me feel and how will it look to other people when I'm wearing it.
Yep.
It's funny though, because how do I put this? I get a lot of resistance. This is probably the lesson that I get the most resistance in the course. And, students will always say, Doug, I don't buy anything due to status or how things make me feel. I buy it because, I believe in things I buy fair trade coffee, or I buy Patagonia clothing, or I buy organic food because of what it is. How would you respond to that?
I think that, especially in the options that we have to consume right now, because we have so much access to so many different options, I think that I actually had a conversation recently about coffee. And so and coffee has to do with taste too, right? So it's subjective, and obviously you may prefer one type of coffee over the other because it tastes better. But if you're willing to buy that coffee, dump it into a ceramic canister and toss it out without the label ever being around, right? Are you still attached to the status of it? Or is it really about, I support this company, I support the idea of fair trade, I support the taste, whatever it might be. So I think that's kind of the perception, right? Where it's can you buy that coffee and just never tell anybody about it? Never talk about it. Maybe that's more aligned with the values internally than externally. But also evaluating how much of those little labels that we see on things like fair trade or hand ground or whatever, or hand roasted or roasted in small batches, whatever it might be, is actually necessary to our consumption of the product, and how much of it is just marketing, how much of it is just trying to convince us that it changes the experience of that product or changes the quality of that product. And I think a lot of it is marketing.
Well, what occurs to me, you talk about it, is like, I mean, I don't drink coffee. And in the lesson, there's a Adam Ruins Everything video about wine and how difficult it is to discern. You basically cannot tell the difference between expensive wine and inexpensive wine. But I think a lot of it is, even if things taste different, what makes the more expensive thing that tastes different better, right? And I think a lot of it is in bourgeois capitalism, the fact that you can discern something is a marker of taste and class, right? Like, for someone who doesn't care about coffee, it doesn't matter whether this thing has like a more mushroomy or earthy taste to it. But like when you care about coffee and you can more importantly afford to buy coffee, all of a sudden the fact that you can taste the subtle differences is a thing that you want.
I feel like food is tricky for me, especially. That's been a really hard one. And that's my area where I kind of spin on my budget because not that I don't necessarily gravitate towards higher cost food, but I gravitate towards variety. So it means that I spend on food a lot because I want to taste different things. I want to have different experiences. I want to have Indian, then I want sushi, then I want Mexican, and then I want, Italian. And so it doesn't mean that I'm going to the nicest Indian, the nicest sushi, the nicest Italian place, but it's just about that variety. And I think that's been a struggle I shouldn't say a struggle. This is actually where, there's a conversation about it's a constant evolution about the conversation of your values and your money. Like, where are we putting that money? And is it aligning with our values and what we want to be spending on? So I think for me, like physical sense of like your actual sense of taste, you may happen to like the cheapest wine the best. And that's fine. But our society tells us that it's not, because if you want to be perceived as something, whatever it may be, you wouldn't be drinking that box of wine, right? You would be drinking this fancy bottle of wine. And that's, I think, where this lesson is really important, is because it sort of helps detangle the perception, or it detangles it and it helps you examine it. It's like, why am I choosing this really expensive bottle of wine at the store? Even though like all I want is fermented grapes. Am I choosing
all
this?
Is good.
Yeah.
I just want to feel a little tipsy tonight.
I want to feel right. What's the utility behind it? Is the utility like, I really want to get drunk? Maybe $2 Chuck is fine. So what's the utility behind it? And I think we have the luxury and the privilege, most of us, to decide is the utility about tasting something sweeter or more tart? Doesn't mean that expensive or cheaper, but what is the flavor that we're craving, right?
It's so funny because, again, I don't drink wine. I don't drink alcohol. So it's hard for me. But like sometimes like I have to bring a bottle of wine to a dinner party. Man, I just want to bring a bottle of $2 Chuck because one, I'm a cheap person. Two, I don't care. But you cannot bring a bottle of $2 Chuck to a dinner party.
Right? You can't.
Yeah, you can't. Right? You have to buy a, quote, nice bottle of wine that is, appropriate for the occasion. Anyways, that's an aside. But I think what you're talking about, variety, is a very interesting thing because variety speaks to cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. Like you and I, maybe our parents are the first generation in human history that like get whatever food they want.
Yes.
Right? Like last week I went to Japanese one night, then I went to like get pizza the next night. I had friends in town. And then like the next night we got Italian. Like we just eat whatever we want from around the world, right? Mm-hmm. Like literally for the last 10,000 years, people ate the same thing, maybe for every single meal. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. I mean, I remember like when I was younger, I wouldn't eat sushi because it was way too foreign. And now, like, I think eating sushi is a certain marker of class and taste. And I love sushi.
Which is interesting in our culture, right? Because it's a marker of class and taste in America. But in, Japanese culture, it's a norm, right? And so the idea that we have access to foods that are outside of what our plain old American diet would be, and that we can choose to spend money on them or not, right? And then talk about them and then compare our notes with other people. I've had so much sushi. I have a preferred sushi place and
right.
Like that's all the status piece, right?
Yeah.
Or it doesn't even have to be sushi. It could be sandwiches, right? Where we're like, oh, no. The best sandwich place is here. And that's a status thing because I've been able to pay for so many different sandwich places. I now have a preference,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, for me, like our family, like this dim sum place is good and this dim sum place is trash. Right?
Yeah.
Because we eat a lot of dim sum and we have my family has the income to go to the best dim sum place we can. This is tiny details exaggeration syndrome. Like my family only want to go to, quote, the best dim sum. And we have arguments about, is this a good dim sum place or not?
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely, because again, you're choosing, this was a Mr. Money Mustache quote, so I've got to give credit, but you're choosing between two shades of a very close, bright, happy green, right? It's like the fact that we can choose between, we're arguing about access to dim sum, right? Like how great it is that we have multiple dim sum places to choose from, that we can access both of them and then choose which one we would prefer. When in the history, like someone living in America, right, had zero access to where I grew up. It wasn't far, but I would have to make an effort to travel to go to dim sum.
Well, this brings up another thing that Mr. Money Mustache said, which is most of what we think our needs are just other people's expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I think about it, like later on, there's a lesson about needs, wants, and bullshit about budgeting. And I say, you have to budget for your needs, right? But our needs are really contextualized in what other people's expectations are. Like I live in a house, right? And my house is in a certain area of Portland, right? A certain hip area of Portland. I could have bought a much cheaper house somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so even the things that we think are necessary, including like, I have to live in a place that has Asian food, and have to is what I'm going to put in quotes, right? And so there are certain quote needs I have and where I live, which are just like quite frankly, bullshit. I say bullshit. I should qualify that as these are the things that I have decided that are important to me, but they're the things that I've decided that are important to me according to my identity.
Yes.
And I think the secret lesson is identity is super fluid. Right? Like the very first quote in the lesson is from Alan Watts. The most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who or what you really are behind the mask. And, my identity as someone who cares about food or someone who lives in a certain neighborhood, it's all a mask.
I was just going to say, it's interesting too, because I've moved around a lot, and it's interesting because every time you land in a new place, you get to design that new mask. Which just speaks to the idea that status is different wherever you are too, right? Because am I we're thinking about status in each new place, right? Like, how do I fit in to this area? How do I assimilate to this culture? How do I make sure that I'm indulging in the things that they're indulging in, right? Yeah. When I lived in New York, it was about fashion, like outward appearances. And that's how you're spending your money. And a lot of the conversation is around that. When I live in Portland, it's about food. And I'm talking about food all the time. And that's how people are showing status. When I lived in Boston, it was how much Dunkin' Donuts you could drink. How many times have you been to Dunkin's today? Like, it's interesting, like even
That's
the
hilarious.
Small places and then what you talk about.
When I lived in Boston and I was a lawyer in Boston, the status was where you went to school.
Yes. Oh,
where you
yeah.
went to school was very important in Boston. New
Yeah.
York, it was about like what you did for a living or like how much money you made. In Portland, yeah, to me, it's really about, the food, what food you eat and what your hobbies are. What your hobbies are super, super important in Portland.
Super important.
Yeah.
And also like where you're traveling to, or how frequently you're traveling, or camping or being outdoors. Like, I feel like that's a status thing as well.
What are you doing with your free time? So super statusy thing in Portland.
Yeah.
Let's move to the second part of this lesson, which is about how advertising and marketing is all about the creation of, a perceived lifestyle for you.
Yeah.
And since you work in the industry, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah. So I feel like, marketing exists to get you to want to purchase something. Like, it exists purely for that purpose, and is always interesting to me. One, that marketing exists, right? In our society, it makes sense in a capitalist society for it to exist. But the fact that it needs to continue to evolve is what's fascinating to me, because it can't stay stagnant, right? And if it stays stagnant, society at large somehow tells you that that's not hip anymore, and we shouldn't buy it anymore, and it's not interesting anymore. And so that's why marketing continues to exist as a field and continues to evolve. And I think that's the biggest thing to look at with a lens, is how much of the information we're getting is actual information about the utility of a product, about how it actually meets our need, our true need. And it's almost none, right? We might get a little teeny bit of could you imagine seeing a clothing commercial that's like, these jeans will protect you from the elements, right? That's not going to be a thing. It's all about the way you look. It's all about the way you're perceived. It's all about the fun activities that are happening while you're wearing these jeans, and things like that.
Well, I just think about, I don't actually, I have an Instagram, but I don't use it. But like when I've seen Instagram, it's really just about young women, right? Like young, attractive white women. And that's the thing that they're really selling, but I guess both to men and to women.
You don't even have to see that on Instagram. You could see that in like drug commercials, like for, like on the TV, which is really funny to me. Like, one, that we even market for drugs or prescription pharmaceuticals, but it's still young white women having an enjoyable time somehow, by taking this heart medicine or blood pressure medicine.
Well, I have two thoughts here. One, someone told me once that nothing you actually need is ever marketed, because you already know that you need, like, you'll never see a commercial for carrots. Like rice, you'll never see a commercial for, right? Anything that is like an actual need, you'll never see advertisement for, because people will buy it anyway, right? And so it brings up the second point, which is, someone once said that if you tell someone there's something wrong with them with enough conviction, they'll believe you. And that is the job of a marketer, right? And so a marketer, their job is to tell you, like, you don't belong unless you buy this thing.
Yeah, or you could be a better version of yourself if only you. Like, that's the piece too, is like convincing you that there's room for improvement, right? There's something missing.
Yeah, I just I had a FF1 meetup with my current cohort, both students, and the thing we talked about most was the sense of not enoughness that we feel in capitalism, right? And whenever we're surrounded by messages of like, you could be a better version of you, the direct implication is that you're not enough, or what you're doing is not enough. And I wrote this little post that afterwards, which someone said in the meetup, you always feel like you're not measuring up.
Yeah, it's true. I feel like that is pervasive in our society. And I actually think about this a lot with the income conversation in the FIRE community, about like, there's always room to increase your income. I think that's true to a point, but also the flip side of that is, recognizing what enough is, and when it's okay to not increase your income or to not be take on like 50 side hustles or one side hustle even, right? When I first started reading about FI, I was like, I obviously need to get a second job, obviously, right? And I was like, wait, hold on here. Luckily, I had worked at least 2 jobs for the majority of my life, and I had finally gone down to 1 job, and I sort of was able to hit pause on that pretty quickly. But a lot of people don't. They're saying I obviously need more. I am not enough. I need to make more. And I think that's actually kind of an undercurrent that's pretty harmful in the FI community. The idea that we have to increase our income, and not pausing and looking around and saying, oh, actually, I'm doing just fine. At $100,000 job. That's great. And here's my stress level and I know how to manage it. And I'm covering my needs. And I can hit my goal by 45 instead of 40. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. But I'm absolutely guilty of that, where I was like, nope, gotta turbocharge it. And how do I do more? And how do I get more? So it's kind of interesting looking at it in a different angle. It's really easy to look at it, I think, in, the material things, but talking about income, I think that's important too.
I'm curious, do you have regrets in taking the higher paying job?
I do and I don't. The regret I have is I had an opportunity to pause at that point in time and take a break then when my son was about 3-ish. And I go back and forth debating if that was the right move to not pause and to really take advantage of the moment to make such a big jump in salary. And I think the only reason that I can have this regret or discussion is because I did so well and I took the higher salary. I've hit my goals and now I can go back and debate whether or not it was worth it. Right. But I do think about, during that time, it was COVID, it was shut down. We were scrambling, trying to figure out, how do my partner and I work full time while we have essentially a 3-year-old at home who there's no daycare, there's no childcare, there's no family he can go to. And I kept the gas pedal down instead of stepping back at that point, because I had the goals in front of me. And flexibility that affords me now is basically the whole rest of, essentially, I have the flexibility for the rest of his life, hopefully, with work. So was the trade-off, for 3 or 4 years worth that? Maybe it will be. Maybe I'll look back and I'll be like, I should have paused at that point in time and then pick things back up when he was 6 or 7. I don't know. But right now I have some degree of regret about not having paused at that point in time and instead taking the higher paying job and remaining very busy, very career focused.
It's interesting because Ramit Sethi last week published a video about why he thinks the FIRE movement is wrong. And one of the things he talks about is, one, you become so focused on getting there so fast that you lose everything else. But he talks about this transition, which you may be beginning to face, and maybe you could have faced this earlier, is becomes very hard to transition from a lifestyle of hard saving towards spending, right? But that's the point, right? At some point you hit a number where you don't have to be as frugal or you don't have to work as hard, but it's very hard to actually transition to that.
Yeah, I'm in that mode right now. So, and it is very hard. I think I also really like the numbers, the gamifying of it, right? Setting a goal, being able to hit a goal, running calculations, working, aiming for a bonus, getting the bonus, throwing that bonus into savings, whatever it might be. it's like a very satisfying process. And it's a very satisfying treadmill to be on in some cases. The flip side of that now is so this year, 2024, stopped our retirement contributions, which like was a physically difficult thing to like change that percentage down for us. I was like, oh my God, I'm only doing the minimum. I'm only doing the match. Feels so irresponsible. How do I? And it was for like a few months. I was just sitting grappling with that. And we're not doing a particularly good job spending, which is maybe good, maybe bad, but we're just saving it in a different bucket essentially right now.
Well, I mean, I think this actually goes to the lesson, which is because you're performing your identity as a financially independent person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're doing the things that FIRE tells you to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the interesting thing about identity. We keep on doing the thing even if it doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Or it's not necessary anymore.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I stopped just blindly throwing it into retirement buckets, because essentially the overwhelming direction was essentially to, if you don't have a plan for it yet, keep saving it for your future self, right? And I sort of wanted to say like, no, I don't want to keep saving it for my future self. I want to challenge myself to spend some of this money, enjoy some of it while I can, and see how that feels. And so we are doing that to a degree, but I am maybe too much on that side of things right now, where I need more. There's a happy medium that now that I'm taking some time off and I have some brain space for that, I hope to find.
Well, I mean, one of the things I always say is there's no such thing as not spending. It's a decision between spending now or spending later. Mm-hmm. And, the book Die with Zero talks about this idea that the majority of Americans will not have enough money for retirement. Mm-hmm. But the minority of Americans that have retirement, most of those people will actually die with excess money. Mm-hmm. So in Vicki Robbins' Your Money, Your Life terms, they died with life on the table.
Yep.
Right? Like they could have done more things. They could have worked less, but they saved too much, basically.
Die with Zero is a great book because of the way it encourages like the constant reflection on what you're doing, right? What's the purpose of all this work? What's the purpose of saving? What's the purpose of amassing this money if we're just going to hold on to it down the road? And the other thing too, so the other work that I'm involved in as an organizer with Portland Housing Solidarity Project, so focusing on Black and Indigenous first-time homebuyers and redistributing money directly to them so that they can essentially get into 1, stable housing, 2, building generational wealth, 3, back into a community that they were largely displaced from here in Portland. I think that's where I've been, quote unquote, spending my extra money, is I'm just seeing the surplus that I have. And when I have it, redistributing it to people who are able to use it within our community, and just sort of recognizing that that's part of this conversation as well. Is not just, how do I die with zero? How do I take, everyone I love to a Caribbean island and throw a party? But also, how do I make sure that the wealth that I have now doesn't just sit compounding, doing nothing for anybody for a long time? How can I get this money into the hands of people who could do something with it right now? And then let it compound for them, and sharing that. So that's part of I've been doing, I've been involved with that for just over a year, and looking at that for me is also really important.
And I mean, you're part of the Jubilee Fund, which mm-hmm. is, your, and a few other people's attempt of like taking our income and paying off people's credit card bills, mm-hmm. So that they can actually get out of credit card debt. and then they pay back at 1% or 0% interest to reparations, so that they feel like donors as opposed to debtors. So, I want to thank you for that. I think what's interesting, you're talking about principles of effective altruism.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, you could, if you're financially free at this point, you could continue working at your $230,000 a year job and just donate it all.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance that idea with time with your kid?
Yeah, that is the trickiest conversation in my head right now, is what is more valuable, essentially. That's ultimately what it comes down to, is how do you value your time? What is most impactful? And how am I defining what's most impactful, right? And what am I willing to sacrifice in turn? And so it's actually a pretty heavy thought for me, thinking about the idea that, yes, I could absolutely continue working at my 200, imagine being able to essentially gift a family $200,000 every year, right? I can just pass that, which is that's an absolutely amazing thought. And or gift 4 families $50,000. It's just wild to be able to think that that's a possibility for me. But what is the trade-off? And the trade-off is essentially time with my kid. And it's a really big, long conversation. We can continue to we don't have time on the podcast for that, but
I'll bring you back for that one.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, the way you talk about it, and I don't have any answers for you, Jessica, so I'll put that out first. But the way you talk about it is a utilitarian capitalist sort of view, like value or utility or trade-offs or sacrifice, which, I'm very intrigued by the effective altruism movement. But I'm just curious, where does the role of your own joy come in?
Yeah. And I think that's the conversation for me, is where, and this actually connects back to status too, right? So intrinsic, where am I motivated internally the most? What feels the best for me, forgetting about what society is expecting, right? And I feel like that the outward message that I'm getting from society is, well, you keep working your job and you pass that forward, right? And you figure out a way to, be that person that donates their income. How amazing. And wouldn't look at all the praise you could get and all the appreciation and all the, progress you could help people make. But internally it's sort of well, but I want to be there for my kid, and and it's obvious that he needs me right now. And, we're going through he's going through some things. And as a result, our family is, and I want to be able to support that. And how do I weigh that with a societal expectation that I have this privilege and I should be giving it back? Right. I also think that's a very Portland thing, right? Where do you donate to? Which nonprofits are you supporting? How are you supporting them? So it's interesting trying to tease that apart for me between those two things.
Yeah, it occurs to me, I've lived in places, I've been in communities, including my own immigrant family, where if you could spend time with your kids or give money to other people, the obvious choice would be to spend time with your kids, right? And it goes back to identity, right? And status groups. Yeah, there would be no contemplation that you should give $200,000 to anybody else. That's crazy talk.
Exactly. Yeah, but I am in a circle and in a society and in our world where it's it seems like the more obvious answer would be to give them, to keep working to give the money out, Yeah. Or, and the flip side of that is, could I hand my job to somebody else, right? How, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that's a conversation that I'm having too. So how do I get somebody else? How can I pass my privilege to somebody else so that they can then have it and then decide what's best for them with it?
Well, I would say, Jessica, that you, and this is part of the reason why you're my friend, you're a very special case, right? You have very unique values and you have a strong sense of who you are. I do want to say, just for the audience, this lesson is about American society. The vast majority of people will decide to make more income and to spend it all, right? So I just wanted to make sure that people get that, we consume twice as much as we did 25 years ago,
Yeah.
4 times as much as we did 50 years ago. And a lot of that is around marketing, advertising, the idea of like, we have to keep on consuming, right? Like, this is the hottest summer on record. And there's no doubt in my mind that our consumption and the fact that we're the hottest summer on record is a fact of we keep on expecting each other to consume more and more.
Yeah.
So I think you're special, and I love you for it, but I just want to make sure that like that point is like really emphasized, that most people are not thinking the way you are and trying to make the decisions you're making.
But it's all the same, right? It's the idea that there is some extrinsic value system that's happening that's influencing our thought process, right? And whether it's the thought process to consume more and just exhaust our financial assets, or do things with our financial assets that other people are doing, it's the same. It's the idea that, how do we look at that from an objective point of view, where we can then say, what are our values? What do I value? Forget about what community is telling me. Forget about what marketing is telling me. Forget about what capitalism is telling me. How do we pull it apart to make sure that we're not consuming blindly, or we're not working blindly, or we're not, ladder climbing blindly, anything.
Yeah, it occurs to me, like, someone once told me that, like, in order to do anything good or exceptional, you have to have an antagonistic relationship to mediocre culture. So I just want to thank you for that, Jess. We're coming up on our time here. Let's make one more pitch for October Financial Freedom 1. After this conversation, why do you think people should take FF1?
Take Financial Freedom 1 if you want to really understand or take a look at your financial goals and understand why FIRE is even an option, and evaluate whether or not you're spending in alignment with your values, helping you define what enough is, helping you understand abundance, adding to the conversation, giving you more language around finances. So I think everybody should take it. It's really sad to think that this might be the last one. I recommend it all the time. I recommended it this past weekend to somebody. So I hope it's not the last one, because it really is an incredibly valuable, massive information. It's a great course, and it's a great dialogue to be in.
Well, thanks, Jessica. It's really nice to see you. I'm glad we're friends, and we'll continue to be friends. And maybe once you cross over, we'll have more time to hang out.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Douglas. Appreciate you as always.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone. You've been listening to the School of Financial Freedom podcast. This is Douglas Soy, and I'm your host. I think we're going to have another episode after this. So stay tuned for that one. Thank you all. Thank you for tuning in to the School of Financial Freedom podcast, where we ask, what does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit into that? We hope you enjoyed this episode and it helps you live with an increasing sense of empowerment, integrity, and agency in the world. For more information, resources, and to re-listen to this or any past episodes, visit our website at schoolofinancialfreedom.com. There you can find out when the next cohort of Financial Freedom 1, the online course, is. If you've enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a review, as it helps more people find us and join our community of people interested in the intersection of money and personal and spiritual growth. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of the School of Financial Freedom. You can also find me on Substack, where you can subscribe to my popular newsletter, Money and Meaning. I also love hearing from readers and listeners, so write me at www.douglassoy.com. I'm grateful that you listened, and I hope that this episode has given you hope and insight into taking control of your finances to live the life you want.